Hi everyone, and welcome to the second panel session of this conference. My name is Peter Hopkins and I'm a Professor of Social Geography at Newcastle University in the northeast of England. So this panel session focuses on migration and displacement, and we're aiming to examine this through the lens of the social sciences and the humanities. So this panel is actually on the social sciences end of the humanities, because we've got sociology, political science and human geography. So to start us off, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Dr. Robin Finlay, who's a human geographer who was at Newcastle but is now a lecturer in human geography at Durham. So the first presentation will be Robin Finlay.
Thank you very much, Peter. Can we just get the slides up? Brilliant. Okay, good morning everybody, it's really nice to be here with you this morning. So I was working on the project which was titled The Everyday Experiences of Young Refugees and Asylum Seekers in Public Space. And this image here is from our recently published report, which gives a bit of an overview of our research project. We've got hard copies of this report. You can get them out there in the foyer area. We've got them in English, Dutch, German and French, so to check what language it is when you take one. So this project had 4 case study cities. It was Leipzig in Germany, Brussels in Belgium, Amsterdam in the Netherlands and Newcastle upon Tyne in the United Kingdom. And myself and Peter worked on the Newcastle upon Tyne case study. So what did we do in this project? So we were examining a range of everyday urban experiences in the lives of young asylum seekers and refugees, including their use and access to public space, their experiences of arrival and integration into new cities, as well as examining the role cultural arts and community organisations play in the lives of young asylum seekers and refugees. So what I want to do in this short talk this morning is I want to focus on the emotional and embodied experiences of claiming asylum and navigating European asylum systems. So Isabel Mier in her 2020 paper argues that we need to think more about the emotional work of borders and what she calls the effect of border violence inherent in the European asylum system. So in the UK, the asylum system incorporates an elaborate array of bordering practices and bordering rules, including dispersal, detention, deportation, no right to work or study, no access to mainstream benefits, as well as protracted asylum cases and highly complicated bureaucracy. So this illustration here, so this was done by an artist that we work with, and she came to some of our meetings when we were discussing our findings, and she's illustrated some of the impacts with respect to being an asylum seeker and the impacts of asylum bordering practices. And up at the top left is the issue of disorientation. So disorientation was a recurring theme that we found in our research, was a recurring emotional and embodied experience. So I'm going to focus on that for this presentation today. So disorientation is a concept that has interdisciplinary interest. It's been of interest to neuroscientists, to gender studies, to human geographers, which is the discipline I'm most closely associated to. Recent humanities and social science research has been really useful in illustrating the multi-dimensional and sort of nuanced nature of disorientation. So disorientation in its most traditional sense is about spatial disorientation. It's about being lost, not being able to navigate space, not being able to get from A to B. But it's also about a sense of being sort of out of place, and feeling of being out of place and not sort of feeling a sense of belonging. So your body can feel very much out of place, situations can feel out of place, and this can all result in sort of different forms of disorientation. So an important contribution in migration studies has been by Tazioli, and what she has done is she's connected the idea of disorientation with asylum systems in the European Union. And she argues that European countries very much govern migration through a politics disorientation. So what I want to do today is kind of build on this work by looking very much at the everyday experiences of the politics of disorientation. So a component of the UK asylum system that we would argue that's explicitly based on this politics of disorientation is dispersal. So dispersal has been a government policy since 1999 in the United Kingdom. Dispersal involves the sending of dispersing of asylum seekers around the United Kingdom, and they're provided houses, and they can have to wait in this dispersal location until there's a decision made on their asylum case. So this map here highlights the areas where asylum seekers are dispersed to, the areas that are in dark and purple, or where they're higher numbers. And a lot of those areas are post-industrial cities, and that's because these are areas where there was cheap available housing to put asylum seekers in. And Newcastle is one of those dark purple ones, kind of a bit before in Scotland. So what I want to think about now, sorry, just on the right page, is think a bit now about the everyday experience of dispersal and how this produces forms of disorientation. So when an asylum seeker is dispersed to an area in the UK, it's on a no-choice basis. They can't decide where they'll go. The dispersal locations are often unknown to the asylum seeker, so they often have no location or knowledge of where they're going to live, and they're regularly given little warning before being dispersed. Many are taken to the dispersal location by the housing provider, and on arrival they're often given very limited information about the local area. The introduction provided by the housing provider will commonly take no more than a few minutes, and once the papers are signed for the house, asylum seekers are left on their own in cities where official state integration support is significantly absent. So all of this, we argue, triggers multi-layered feelings of disorientation. Dispersal destabilises orienting connections to space, relations, bodies, and general life direction. With dispersal being largely an urban phenomenon, dispersal disorientation is underlined by the disorientated sense of urban public space and urban society. Now, the impacts of this are, of course, varied. For some, it's not felt in such a challenging way, but for many, it exacerbates and generates difficult emotions, including anxiety and social phobia, making some socially withdrawn and lonely, especially in the early period of dispersal. So I put up a quote here from Asylum, who's an asylum seeker from Sudan, and he's talking about his early period in Newcastle upon Tyne, and he really illustrates the kind of multi-dimensional nature of disorientation. On one hand, it's spatial. He didn't know how to navigate the city. He had no knowledge about the city. But there was also a relational disorientation. He wasn't able to find relational kind of points of contact because of the language and because of the local accent. So this was very difficult for him. So after initial periods of intense disorientation, asylum seekers usually start to forge out orientations and forms of belonging. Given the absent set of integration support, asylum seekers often carry out reorientation work for their own strategies alongside the support of volunteer and community groups. The labour involved in everyday strategies of reorientation is the everyday work one does to begin to feel more orientated and secure in the dispersal space. And this, of course, shows the resilient and non-passive nature of people seeking asylum. So I've got two quotes here just to elucidate these points. The first one by Asim again, and he's talking about how he got support from a friend of a friend. He had no contacts in Newcastle, but he had a friend in Manchester who then got this friend to go to his house and start providing him orientation help within Newcastle. So very much highlighting the importance of refugee and on-refugee support. Quite often that's the first point, support for asylum seekers. And then the second quote by Hakim is illustrating the importance of community and cultural groups and how this helped him start to become familiar with the city and start to become more active in the city. And a lot of this orientation is very much about using public space and so in some ways finding public spaces to kind of appropriate and use. Now, reorientation, however, is a slow and incomplete process with certain aspects of life potentially becoming more orientated while other aspects remain deeply disorientated. For instance, restricted rights and enforced waiting often sustain feelings of disorientation, especially regarding future directions and transitions into adulthood for younger asylum seekers. And this links to how arrival is an ongoing process. It is much more than just the early period in a new city or country. Indeed, while one remains in the asylum system, significant aspects of their life remain disorientated and not fully arrived. So this quote from Lara really highlights that. She says, I really want to get out of this asylum zone to be able to focus more on my life and see what I want to do in the future. At the moment, everything just comes down to gaining asylum. So she's lived in Newcastle for about 5 years, but she's still stuck in the asylum system. She hasn't got leave to remain, and her life still remains deeply disorientated, especially with respect to kind of orientated direction towards a future and transition into adulthood. So given this persistent nature of disorientation and arrival, I want to finish by arguing for a more sustained and broader interest in these themes. We need to consider the longevity, multidimensional and everyday nature of disorientation and arrival. And this longer and broader view will enrich our understandings of the persistent impacts of borders and bordering practices and how and why they produce and shape different emotions and experiences. So I think if we've got enough time, we're going to show you a very quick video which touches on these themes. We made a number of animated videos from our research. This video is just for a general audience, but I think it gives you a nice flavour of some of the stuff I've just been talking about. Hopefully it'll work.
For those seeking asylum, stepping foot on new soil is the first of many forms of arrival they will negotiate. They also arrive into new political and bureaucratic systems, new medical, educational, and social systems, and new spheres for expression of the self. Arrivals like these can be slow and complex. What does it mean, and what toll does it take when arrival is a process that's ongoing? Some asylum seekers land in one city to find that close family has found sanctuary in another. Some arrive to find services so poor that moving again is their best option. Many carry trauma and find adjustment to their new surroundings challenging and prolonged. And for many, the cumbersome process of applying to become a refugee creates stress and a sense of always waiting. Some find the struggles that cause them to leave home are mirrored in their new communities and must leave and start again.
I first went to Spain, but I didn't have asylum there. I have relatives who don't respect who I am, who have negative opinions about my sexuality. I remember trying to settle in some other places, but I wasn't sure where I was. So after a few days in Spain, I came to Belgium. Here I don't have any family members, so it will be difficult, but at least I have my freedom.
While arrival is stressful, support and opportunity can create an environment where everyone benefits.
I had no idea where I was. Scared and terrified, I found myself in Leipzig. Randomly, I stumbled across this little theatre group. Wow, this was amazing for me. Theatre is more than entertainment. I can express myself, the realities of life, and give a voice to what people are going through.
Arriving is an ongoing process. It requires continuous effort from young refugees as they work to gain knowledge, learn new languages, make connections, and create a new life in a safe place.
I've lived in many different places trying to settle as a refugee. 5 years on, and I feel I'm in Amsterdam. This is my city. I even write poems for Amsterdam. Maybe because it's the first city where I feel safe and where I am part of the people.
Communities that actively welcome refugees and asylum seekers can help soften the challenges and discomfort of arrival. You can help by volunteering at organisations to help support refugees negotiating their arrival, challenging simplistic understandings about arrival and demonstrating sensitivity and care about this often long and complex process, and supporting projects that advance the well-being of refugees and asylum seekers.
We can just finish there. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Robin, for that very rich insight into the everyday lived experiences of refugees. Keeping on this theme, the second panellist that we'll now turn to is Grazyna Szymanska-Matusiewicz. She's a sociologist from the University of Warsaw. So over to you.
Thank you. Let's wait for the slides. Suspense. All right. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. And I will be speaking on behalf of Encounter Points project. That has been conducted in cooperation with researchers from 5 institutions all across Europe. And the project leader was Susanna Eckersley from the Newcastle University. And our project, briefly speaking, was aimed at uncovering multiple renegotiations of belonging in a diverse Europe. And me and 2 colleagues of mine, Małgorzata Głowacka-Gajber and Joanna Wawrzyniak, constituted the Warsaw University team within the project. And we were, in our research, studying the ways in which the migrant communities in Poland negotiate belonging in the social and spatial landscape of Warsaw, as well in the broader context of the Polish society. So we focused on the 3 migrant communities: Ukrainian, Vietnamese, and Muslim communities, and our primarily focus on research were religious institutions of the migrants as the places within the negotiating of belonging takes place. Slide. In my today's presentation, however, I will focus on the very issue of the response of the migrant communities to the acute crisis that has been caused by the Russian invasion on Ukraine. When we speak of this topic, of course, we have to start with the general statement that in the context of Poland, the war and its direct outcome in form of the inflow of the refugees caused this overwhelming sense of danger and insecurity. Everybody was affected in a particular way, although some were more affected than others. When we're speaking of the migrant communities, of course, we have to particularly point out to the Ukrainian community in Poland. I would also like to state at the very beginning that in my presentation I will rather speak about the refugees from Ukraine than Ukrainian refugees, because although the Ukrainian nationals or ethnic Ukrainians have constituted, of course, by far the largest part of this wave of refugees, there were also quite many non-Ukrainian refugees in this population. According to the estimations of the Polish Border Guard, 7% of the border crossings that took place between Ukraine and Poland since the outbreak of the war were non-Ukrainian citizens. And this is particularly important when we speak of the reaction or response of the migrant communities in Poland. I will start from the case of the Ukrainian community. So firstly, of course, it was the community by far and foremost affected by the outbreak of the war. And the topic of its response to the war and the refugee crisis is so vast and broad, and this is of course an ongoing issue, that it's hard to speak about any definitive conclusions. But of course we can state that the community has been completely transformed or even recreated by the war and the inflow of refugees. When we look at the numbers, we can see that before the war, anyways, the Ukrainians formed the largest community, the largest migrant community in Poland, numbering like between 1 million and 1.5 million people. But since February 24th this year, there has been over almost 6 million border crossings between Ukraine and Poland. It doesn't, of course, equal to the total amount of Ukrainians that reside in Poland currently. This number is probably closer to like around 3 million, but still, this is like, of course, an immense change. So I would also like to stress the important factor that although we speak about the outbreak of the war as of February 24, 2022, as one of the panelists in the previous panel has already stated, in fact, the war in the Ukraine has been ongoing since 2014. And that has been the perspective of the Polish-Ukrainian community like for many years. In fact, when we speak of their response to the current war, it somehow is a continuation of the actions that they have been undertaking since 2014. They have been many times trying to raise awareness of the Polish society towards what is going on in the Ukraine. Although one may say that was not very successful, like for the majority of the public opinion in Poland and probably globally, there has been like not real war ongoing in the last couple of years. The February was perceived as this kind of breakthrough moment. To continue, of course, February was the breakthrough moment when this inflow of the refugees started, like at the very, very first day of the Russian invasion. There was an acute need for like humanitarian aid, and people got involved. Like in Poland, it was a huge and massive movement, and of course, the Ukrainian Polish community was on the front lines. When I was speaking to my colleague Małgorzata Głowacka, who was focused in her study on the Ukrainian community about what can I actually share with you, with the audience, about the ways in which the Ukrainian community is helping. She just answered, everyone is doing whatever they can. So it's even hard to speak in any kind of, orderly way about who is doing what. All the associations, organizations, like regular people are getting involved in some way. So it's maybe important to stress that because the community was relatively well-formed and present and quite large, there are many people with specialist competences, the Ukrainian-speaking or Russian-speaking, both languages prove useful in this situation, who are psychologists, doctors, teachers, and thanks to that, they could provide, of course, this kind of acute help, although, of course, it was not sufficient to meet the needs of all of the refugee population. And the organizations that have got involved, this is just kind of one of the examples, have been like the Ukrainian House. Dom Ukraiński is the largest and probably most well-known Ukrainian organization, and they are doing everything they can. So the website, of course, is an important site, serving as a place where people can find help with finding housing or jobs, childcare, and so on and so on. And also religious organizations that we have focused our research on have got involved, like Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, for instance. The crisis management team was appointed at the very beginning of the refugee crisis. The Greek Catholic Church also cooperates with Roman Catholic Church, which in Poland is a very kind of prominent institution with a huge infrastructure that can be very, very useful in this situation. Now I will discuss the case of the communities that have been least directly impacted by the war, but still it has, of course, influenced them. So the Muslim communities in Poland, it's maybe better to speak of communities than of one community, because the Muslim population in Poland is very diverse, although it's relatively small, very multinational, ethnically and linguistically diverse. And it's important to mention two factors that have affected their reaction towards the current refugee crisis. First of them was the so-called Syrian refugee crisis from 2015, and the other has been the more recent so-called border crisis between Belarus and the European Union, or Belarus and Poland, which started in 2021 and actually is lasting until nowadays. The situation in the border is still dire and gruesome for the people who are trying to move from Belarus, territory of Belarus, to Poland. So since 2015, we can observe in Poland this rise of Islamophobic discourse, which has been unleashed by Polish authorities and perpetrated and amplified by state-owned media. And therefore, the situations of the Muslim communities in the face of the current crisis is pretty, I would say, difficult. Of course, the fact that the borders have been open for the Ukrainian refugees have raised this discussion on the double standards for white, non-white, Christian, non-Christian people seeking refuge in Poland, but also in the EU migration politics in general. And it is important to remember that the population of refugees from the Ukraine, among this population there are Muslims too. It's difficult to say how many. Some estimations are even that high as 5 to 10%. There are people of diverse background. There are Tatars from the Crimea Peninsula, for instance. There are people from Central Asian former republics, former Soviet Union republics. There are also students from, for instance, Middle Eastern countries. The Muslim communities in Poland, for instance, the Muslim religious leaders, have responded to these calls and need of providing humanitarian aid in multiple ways. There has been some initiatives. Some of them have been undertaken in cooperation with the global or international Muslim organizations such as the NGO Muslim Hands. However, it must be stressed that for the reasons mentioned at the very beginning, the Muslim organizations are rather trying to maintain a low profile because of this fear of Islamophobia, and they are stressing that whatever aid they offer it to the refugees in general, that this is not the aid or actions directed towards the Muslim communities. Their situation is further complicated by the fact that some people among the Muslim community in Poland and also some of the current refugees are people with Russian passports, for instance, ethnic Chechens. And in the current wave of course, very anti-Russian discourse or attitudes in Poland, their situation got pretty precarious. And the last community that I would like to mention today is the Vietnamese community. It may seem surprising what is the connection between the Vietnamese in Poland and the case of the Ukrainian war, but in fact the community proved to be one of the most involved and active in terms of engagement in the humanitarian aid. And it is related partly to the fact that Ukraine hosted quite a large Vietnamese community before the war. It's hard to speak about the numbers. The official numbers are around 7,000, but there are many people, undocumented migrants. Some estimations reach even 50,000. And most of them were located in Kharkiv, so the city is very much affected by the war. And most of the Vietnamese left Ukraine immediately after the war broke out. And there was a huge need of providing aid to them because they have faced a huge uncertainty because of the lack of the access to the information. Many of those people, for instance, didn't speak any other language than Vietnamese. And the community in Poland proved very, very important in this respect. For instance, the Facebook groups, such as the largest group gathering Polish Vietnamese, have served as an important source of information, but also mobilization for the community that has conducted multiple efforts, such as providing transport from the border, material help, accommodation, and so on and so on. according to some like activists that delivered like interview to Radio Free Asia, like maybe 1/3 of the Vietnamese residing in Poland got actively involved in these actions. And then these are just material aid offered by the Vietnamese community. There were also transports sent directly to the Ukraine, not for the Vietnamese nationals, but for the Ukrainians. And also the organizations and associations, including religious organizations, the pagodas, got involved. And here, if we will be able to play this short video in the background, I don't know if it will open, but if yes, this was supposed to be the video from the Vietnamese state television, and they were documenting the ways in which one of the pagodas located near Warsaw served as a place providing accommodation. Oh yeah, we've got it. Oh. Yeah, so these are like the Vietnamese arriving to Poland, and this is the pagoda located in the vicinity of Warsaw, and the Polish-Vietnamese community was providing like, accommodation, food, and also like later the Vietnamese state institutions through the Vietnamese embassy got involved providing the transport, so like the free flights back to Vietnam. It was also a very interesting interplay between these grassroots efforts by the migrant community and the actions of the Vietnamese state. I will not have time to speak about it in details, but it was interesting. All right, I think that we may, just the very last thing I would like to share at the end. I think we can skip the next slide, because I don't probably have time for that. But just coming back to the perspective of our project, the outbreak of the war has impacted it directly. We were planning to organize a series of public debates, which were to be conducted subsequently in 2020, 21, 22. The outbreak of COVID, firstly, forced us to move these debates, and all of them were to be organized as one series in April 2022. However, with the outbreak of the war, it proved to be impossible to organize like a nice debate in a in cooperation with Museum of Warsaw with the Ukrainian community. We are still working on some kind of common event or action that can be organized. But we have organized 2 debates with the representatives of Vietnamese and Muslim communities, and they were sharing their experiences in getting involved and helping the refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Grazyna for such an interesting set of insights there, and perhaps some quite unexpected solidarities that might arise in different kinds of crises, so thank you very much. So I'll now move on to the final panellist, who is Riva Kastoryano, who's a political science professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and you're part of the PLURISPACE project. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Yes, the PLURISPACE project's title is Negotiating Diversity in the Expanded European Space. It's endless negotiations of belonging and of representation, of course. And this is a collaborative project with the University of Bristol, Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, and the University of Oslo. And 2 of our teams are here, Luana Rochas, Franco Rocha and Pierre-Luc Dupont, who is from the University of Bristol. So I thank them particularly for their involvement in this project. So our project focuses, as the title indicates, on the management of diversity in order to achieve an integrated public space that is a cohesion among the communities and the state. So, but we understand by the European public space is expanded public space. It includes also the United Kingdom after Brexit, of course, which is a special case, and Norway, who is not a member of the European Union. So we focus mainly on post-colonial migration, and that is, we call them post-colonial. We didn't want to call them ethnic groups. We didn't want to call them minority groups. These are terms that are not done it in the French context, and so we call them post-migrants as a population who is looking to, who are claiming for representation and recognition, and we are interested in the role of religion, and the increasing influence of diaspora politics, how the home countries intervene in politics of integration. So therefore, our research has been from the beginning multi-level, on a city level, local level, national level, and European level. So we identified, the most complicated aspect is that we identified from the beginning 4 theoretical approaches. I'm sorry I don't have slides, but maybe it would have been useful to have them for all these terms that I'm using. And we identified 4 theoretical approaches: multiculturalism, interculturalism, transnationalism, and cosmopolitanism. And see how these different approaches, concepts, normative concepts, have a different understanding of shaping in the public space. And the objective of the project is to what extent these theoretical normative approaches work in the field. And what are the representation, what are the perception of the actors, volunteer association leaders, policymakers, city councils, their perception of these concepts, and how do they see it working in the field. The objective, the final objective, is to come up with a new normative view, a new normativity of what really works on the field. So how to achieve a cohesive public space, integrated public space in each society and in the European space. So we have started our empirical research during the COVID. So of course the interviews have been by Zoom most of the time. We don't have video, and we don't have, but we recorded some interviews. So the objective was to see the reaction with regard to what is integration, what does integration mean for these 4 perspectives, and what does integration mean in the field? What kind of solidarity we are facing, and what is the perception of citizenship? What is really citizenship in the field, and what is the theoretical understanding of citizenship, and of course as a basis for equality. So we had 75 interviews, 8 cities, 20 interviews in each city, 2 in each country, 2 in France, 2 in Britain, 2 in Spain, and 2 in Norway. So, and actually, since I wanted to focus much more on the crisis, since the beginning of this project, we have been facing, and we are still facing, 2 major crises. One is the COVID and the sanitary crisis, and the other is war, immigration, and refugee crisis that we've been talking. So, which actually the refugee and migration crisis is not new, since we have been facing this since 2015 with the Iraqi and Syrian, Afghan, and Eritreans coming that you mentioned in your research. So we both are global crises, and that are reshaping the national public spaces, who are changing the discourses, affecting the discourses, and affecting the institutional setting, and affecting and reshaping the public space on a city level, on a local level, national level, and European level. And they are redefining migration policies and asylum seeker policies, and of course the management of diversity. And of course, to what extent we are facing a reconceptualizing of the European identity with all this research. So, from the empirical perspective, we have, as I said, the perception of policymakers, of leaders of voluntary associations, and on these 4 concepts. Of course, we had to define our concepts, and each country has its own concept. The Britain emphasized on the multiculturalism approach, the Spanish emphasized much more on the interculturalism approach, the French approach was more combining all, but more on a social fact that is a transnational solidarity, and the Norwegian approach was much more on cosmopolitanism, and see how these concepts make sense in reality. But here I wanted to focus much on reality with regard to solidarity, equality, and citizenship and belonging, and I said. Here I wanted to focus much more on the effect of COVID with regard of this, since we are in humanitarian crisis. So each country, according to its own ideology of diversity, discourses and understanding of integration, reacted to the COVID-19 crisis. UK, for example, emphasized much more the problem of employment and discrimination and ethnic and racial division that caused the COVID cause, and occupation and working conditions, because Britain has racial and ethnic data that we don't have in France. And the COVID created was also related to Black Lives Matters, that Pierre-Luc Dupont can correct me if I'm wrong, because he is the researcher on the field. And of course, the attention was to Muslim population and their access to welfare and vaccination. France relied much more on national and international solidarity, and effect on migration policy. There's of course talking about displacement and migration. COVID stopped migration, but the most important, COVID stopped family reunification of migrants. And studies and reports show that migrants banlieues or some concentrated areas were much more affected by the COVID, and neighborhood solidarity worked in some cases, like in the city, like we did another approach of the research of Belleville, where they created a soup that is, some personal initiative creating, distributing food during the COVID. So there was also a neighborhood solidarity. Spain focused much more on the welfare system to blame, that the welfare system didn't work in order to bring equal treatment facing the COVID. And it focused also on the effect of interaction. The approach was much more interculturalist, so it affected the interculturalist approach. And in the neighborhood, stopped, of course, the family reunification. And again, there's an inequality with regard to vaccination, the information about the COVID and social distancing. Norway is, of course, again, stopped of family reunification, and also some comments affected the Muslim population that increased the stigmatization of this population. So the common ground of all these four countries, and I'm sure many more, is how this COVID crisis increased inequality in society. And this inequality in terms of ethnic and racial differences, inequality in terms of social class and access to information and health and treatment. So with regard to migrant crisis, we are all focused on Ukraine, of course, in 2002, since February 2022, But that was not new, since Europe has been facing this migration crisis since 2015, with the arrival that reshaped, the big discourse was the reshaping of the public spaces in all countries and in the European space. And but the difference is the geography of the refugees and the asylum seekers, much more focused on Europe and European perspective. So the crisis of 2015 were much more, the refugees were much more from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Eritrea, and I heard this morning that even on France Culture that there are 4 children died in the Mediterranean, crossing from Turkey to Crete. And then there's a new boat leaving from Tunisia to Italy. So this wave is not over, even though if all the attention is on the Ukrainian. So there were 1 million and 3 million of refugees coming from this route, and the route was Mediterranean and the Balkans. And of course, it led to a redefinition of the borders, redefinition of policies, and redefinition of Schengen, questioning the validity and continuity of Schengen, creating some tensions among member states of the European Union. It mobilized, of course, NGOs, humanitarian approaches to save this population. And the political effect, as I said, was on migration policy and border policy, and the most important was also the rise of populist discourses and international negotiations, mainly with Turkey, to stop this migration on the Mediterranean. So, with regard to Ukrainian crisis, and of course 7 million people are fleeing from Ukraine, is a neighbor country to the European Union, and it's a neighbor country to Poland, where we are. And so we, of course, we didn't interview, we focused much more on the settlement and diversity, settled diversity in the European space, and we didn't do any interviews with migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. But the route is different. They come by train, entrance facilities. There's a huge solidarity, European solidarity, to French, local, and voluntary individual solidarities, families opening their house to Ukrainian refugees, and mayors, municipalities, city councils mobilizing. So we are, as you mentioned also, it's a difference in the treatment, in difference in the perception, and in difference on the value of the migrants themselves in this two understanding of two ways, two routes, and two geographies of refugees and asylum seekers. So the big change is the change in discourse. And rather than mobilizing the populist discourse where they competed for the Syrian and Iraqi refugees, there is no such thing, but the competition is just for voluntary aids of population. And of course, mobilization in any case of NGOs. On the one hand is the easy integration, and the word assimilation will be back, maybe. And on the other hand, the other refugee crisis will brought the discourse about security threat more than integration. So all this affects, of course, the understanding of the European public space. And are we really talking about the European identity coming back with this refugee crisis? So to conclude, I would say, with terms of research, that all these crises are global. And as another paradox of globalization, that is the focus of inequality in every level. On a community level, and interaction about communities, interaction amongst and the community level, on a national level, states, and unequal development of states, unequal suffering of states from this crisis. The Ukrainian crisis is not just a war, it's also a global economic crisis, that some countries are suffering more than others. And of course, it's also the climate change that we should take into consideration for this global crisis. So the main focus of all these crises that is created is a global inequality among communities, among states, and that and with regard to our four concepts that we developed in this research that we wanted to apply on local, national, and European level, that is multiculturalism, interculturalism, transnationalism, and cosmopolitanism, I wonder to what extent that multiculturalism, let's leave it aside because it was just on a national level based on citizenship and equality, but we are doing much more for this on interculturalism, putting communities in interaction with each other and with the national community, talking about transnationalism, increasing the transnational solidarity beyond diaspora politics, and cosmopolitanism as a main value of dealing with inequality with regard to this global crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Riva. Lots of big issues there. Wow, 4 concepts. That's really got me thinking. So there's around 15 to 20 minutes for questions. I'm under strict instructions to finish on time because it's lunch and lots of people will fall out with me if I overrun. So we're definitely going to finish on time. If I can open the floor to any questions or comments, perhaps it's a question for the whole panel, or perhaps it's for one or two of the panellists. Any questions to start us off? Here's one.
Yes, Szymanska-Matusiewicz from the Austrian Academy of Sciences. First of all, I would like to compliment all of you for your research projects, because I'm so impressed in terms of how applied they are. They really look at the field, as you said, and try to learn lessons. So I was wondering, listening especially to the first presentation, but then like this I think applied to all your research projects. Regarding the attitudes of majority societies towards arrival and disorientation, I have read in the context of the German-speaking countries that actually attitudes and methods have been changed, for example in schools, that Ukrainian refugees are now allowed to stay in Ukrainian classes when they arrive. And even the Ukrainian Culture Ministry has negotiated that some elements of Ukrainian curriculum can be continued in classes in Germany, for example. And from what I've heard from previous refugees in Germany is that, before that, the expectation of integration and assimilation really wasn't alienating experiences in these first, let's say, integration courses. That, sensibilities of the majority society, how to recycle properly, to be quiet, the virtues of German society that were really much cultural, really heightened the experience of being alienated. So I wondered if you have any insights about how your research can actually have direct effects of how majority societies should differently welcome refugees and what exactly should be changed. And then secondly, I just have a short question for the first presentation as well. I was just admiring your video and the artist that you involved in creating your dissemination materials. I wanted to ask you, was that something you conceptualized from the beginning with a certain purpose? Yeah, and what's my compliments for that? Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, you might be able to.
I'll do the bit with video.
Thank you very much for the question, a very good question. I mean, I think thinking about kind of different forms of integration, how it works, I think within the UK context, what you really need to understand is there's very little state-led integration. It's pretty much non-existent in Newcastle. You can eventually access an English language course, which is, I think, sort of partly funded by the state, but you still have to wait 6 months, if not longer, before you can access that. So it's primarily done through third sector organisations, charity organisations, religious organisations. And they're obviously providing a really key support to new arrivals in the city. But thinking about, key ways of welcoming, what I think I found in Newcastle is that the refugee-led organisations that have a real understanding of the trauma that people are going through, the real understanding of what it's like to arrive in a new place, have been absolutely critical and really help with the orientation. And that's partly down to practical reasons such as language and cultural understanding. But I think that's something that needs to be integrated in more. I think we need to kind of be cautious with the paternalistic kind of approach to integration. So yes, I think that's kind of how I sort of, yeah.
Thank you. Do either of you want to respond? No? Just on the question about the video, we said in our application that we would produce some animated videos, and I think the intention was that it would have evolved in a bit more of a sort of engaged fashion, but because of COVID, that didn't really work out. So essentially, as a research team, we felt that there was a couple of key issues that we wanted to focus on in the video, and basically we wrote the script, and Stacey Bias, the very gifted animator who did all the background stuff, she did everything else. But essentially we produced a script. She gave some feedback and suggested some edits, and she's quite she says she likes to be difficult at the start and ask awkward questions about who her audience is and what her key message was, which is quite useful to help us focus down. So essentially we produced the words and she did everything else basically, so just to give you a bit more background on that.
Maybe for me. Okay, so then just one remark from me, because I really kind of agree with your statement that we may possibly observe the return or recurrence of the assimilationist discourse, particularly in case of Poland, because here, like, the Ukrainians have been perceived as this kind of source of the cheap labor force, even, of course, long before the war has started, and of course they were often put in a contrary to these refugees from other places, particularly like refugees from non-European countries, as the ones who assimilate, integrate/assimilate quickly and easily. And we can observe it now, they are, even here in Warsaw, I have noticed some billboards which were stated in the Ukrainian language that the Ukrainian teachers are welcome in Poland. So we of course observe many kind of difficulties after COVID, but not only because of that in terms of labor market. And I think that this is the direction in which the discourse in Poland will go in. So I think it's a very accurate remark.
Just to pick up on this term of assimilation that was attributed to France for a long time, and all our researchers and all the teams of the French assimilationist approach, etc. Today, the word assimilation is a taboo, and we talk more about integration. And there's a whole debate among us, researchers and political decision makers, etc., to what extent we should talk about assimilation or integration, and even what we are expecting from integration, what is expected, not we. What is expected from integration is in terms of citizenship, not to be a loyal citizen, which in other ways can be related to assimilation. But again, whenever we use this term, we can put it in quote unquote, since it is not anymore politically correct.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a couple of questions over here. Should we take both? Maybe we could take one question and then the other at the same time. Yeah, do you want to go first?
Yes. I was just having a question to prolong what you were saying. I was wondering to what extent the differentiated response to the Ukrainian crisis as opposed to the Syrian crisis is not also related, because the Ukrainian crisis is actually perceived as a crisis. And crises have this good that they are supposed to end at some point. When in the Syrian case, I wonder if the perception of the European population, of course there are other cultural elements you pointed out very accurately, but I wonder if in the Syrian case, we are not facing an imaginary of the population saying that it has no solution what is happening there. So those refugees, to the opposition to the Ukrainian refugees, are here to stay. And maybe this also explains the differentiated approach. And the question is also, to what time frame the actual support is projecting? I mean, I have seen a lot of solidarity everywhere, Romania, in France, everywhere. But when you talk to the people, they think that it will be for a short time. And I wonder how those people will react when they realize that, unfortunately, I'm the first one to deplore this, unfortunately, I'm afraid that war in Ukraine will not end anytime soon. And we need to provide long-time support.
Thank you. And the person at the front want to ask their question as well.
Hi, my name is Olesa Kromichuga, also the Ukrainian displaced people. And actually my question is related to your previous question. So, when we talk about refugee crisis, actually I think it's Agnieszka Kuban who spoke about it, a scholar at UCL, that, previous refugee crises were crises of bureaucracy. Whereas this one is actually a refugee crisis because of its scale and so on in Europe. And bureaucracy actually showed itself as being quite resilient, at least in the EU. Not so much in the UK. I would say there was a lot of incompetence, or maybe strategic incompetence, when it came to allowing Ukrainian displaced people to enter the UK. Would you agree that that we see some resilience in the bureaucracy, especially lifting visa restrictions and so on, and allowing people to stay and work and build some kind of lives here? And are there lessons to be learned from this response to Ukrainian displaced people that could be then used in relation to other communities? And of course, we have to be frank and admit that one of the reasons why it was like that is because these were European refugees, because mostly they were white and so on. And the sort of the related question to that: are there good practices or lessons to be learned from other refugee crises when it comes to Ukraine fatigue and war fatigue? You all spoke about how welcoming the communities were all over Europe towards Ukrainian refugees, but it's changing already and it's likely to keep changing, and people will simply get exhausted. Are there strategies that we can put in place as societies, as academics, as scholars, and so on, to help with them?
Thank you. Any of the panellists want to respond to? Do you want to go?
Yes, thank you for your questions. And yes, of course, to what extent we think that one war will end, the other will not end. One is an endless flows, and but to what extent now, having worked on migration, not war, not refugees, not asylum seekers, migration is a project of going with the idea of return. Most of the time, and when you come from those countries, is that you make you migrate for a social mobility and upward mobility and go back. And unfortunately, any displacements do not lead to return every time. And to what extent now geography doesn't matter? Geography matters. Syria, Iraq are in the Middle East. There is a representation of those population of those countries, of course, and it's not the border. There is a Turkey as a buffer between them, and Turkey is not a country on which you can rely for this to manage these refugee flows. And there's no an agreement, a budgetary agreement with another country related to Ukraine, because Ukraine is at the border of the European Union. And so their imagination, geography, representation, prejudice, stigmatization, and of course they all matter. And of course what we see from these two crises, from these two flows, is the level of skilled population coming from one side and coming from the Middle East. And of course the economic crisis affecting much more those countries than where the flows continue. And it can seem like endless, and it seems endless. But to what extent, with the Ukrainian population moving to the West, the opportunities will not make them stay in the West. And the issue of stigmatization will not play in the same way, because geography, culture, religion, and are not the same. So even if we change our discourses, we start with the prejudice, and the most effective and the most something that you can see most is the populist discourse that work for one and the other, and this is the danger that Europe and all the democratic societies are facing. And so it's a much more complicated and mobilizes much more efforts from NGOs, from democratic values, from different understanding of, again, geography, culture, and religion that matters in the difference of the two flows of refugees. It's not I don't think it's only the length of the war. One is new, the other is old, and is very old. It's not just 2015, but both in the Middle East, the United States caused this war and created this refugee crisis. And and now add to these refugees, war refugees, add economic refugees that will amplify the situation, I guess.
So I would maybe like to add that, of course, I very much agree that this issue of temporality is very important. And it is visible, for instance, in the kind of debates or considerations in public policies. For instance, what to do with the Ukrainian children that have arrived to Poland in such a great numbers, whether to create separate classes or whether to disperse them among the general students' population. Of course, when we think differently, whether this is a temporary stay in Poland or whether they are here to stay, the policies would be shaped differently. But also, I would like to say that, of course, in Poland and probably elsewhere, we can already observe this kind of huge resistance and worries about how the presence of this huge population will impact the society. This all kind of uncertainty about, for instance, let's say access to public services, healthcare system, and so on and so on. On the other hand, we can observe this certain degree of maybe openness, but towards Ukrainians as this source of labor force or even more specialized kind of human resources. Although I would say that this is very limited, and huge expectations are being put in front of those people. So of course they are supposed to, this is could be probably defined in terms of this invisibility burden. This is the notion used in social science, when we expect the migrants, the newcomers, to conform to our norms, and this politically incorrect notion of assimilation yet again comes into our minds. Whether what we can observe in Poland, let's say, is not the return of assimilationist discourse par excellence. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think the last question there, I think partly was about what our role is as academics. I think was what you were touching on. I mean, I think there's been so many insights on this panel that I think kind of exemplify the role that we could have or that we could play. I'm just really struck at how important it is that we demystify some of the sort of dominant discourses around these issues. I would never have thought about Vietnamese refugees in Poland. That was fabulous. So ideas like that from grounded research that's based on real lived experiences. So I think it can really challenge the sort of dominant understanding, and depending on the strength of the people that are in the skill set of those that are involved, whether it's informing policy, through engaging with policymakers and practitioners at a sort of high level and sort of better informing their understanding of these issues. And then there can be more, like the video that we've done that could be used for, students or younger children to help them understand the issues. So I think there's a whole range of different ways that we can engage with different audiences. My message is always we should have diverse outputs for different audiences, because, only so many people will read a journal article that's behind a paywall. Whereas if we can produce different outputs, we might engage with different people. But I'm conscious that it's about to be lunchtime, so I would just like to thank everyone for their participation, and in particular our three panellists. So we just put our hands together and thank everyone for their contributions.